First off, I want to say that we are standing here on stolen Duwamish land, and it's important that we don't forget that. And I'm going to talk about a little bit what we're going to talk about, climate change and systems of oppression. And so we're going to talk about capitalism, colonialism, the prison industrial system, and how that relates to climate change. And within each of these, we're going to talk about racism. But we're not going to explicitly talk about racism, because with these systems of oppression, it's kind of like when you bake a cake. When you bake a cake with sugar, it would be easier to just remake the cake than to try to take the cake and to try to take the sugar out of that cake. And that is what happens when you try to take racism out of capitalism or colonialism or the prison industrial system or climate change. Racism is embedded. It's the ingredients that created this. And so it's important for us to understand that. So who are we? I guess the picture is a choice. But, we are women of color that all are climate activists. And we actually met each other during the Shell No activism. And the Shell No activism, it was successful. We stopped them. But it was also, as a woman of color, a difficult space to be in. And a lot of the mainstream environmental groups don't really speak to us, and we don't feel like there was a place for us. So we actually decided to create this group to create a space for us, to create a space for the marginalized voices that are on the front lines of climate change. So I keep bringing up climate change, so I'm going to go in a brief overview of what I'm talking about here. So climate change, it really got started in the industrial era when we decided that this coal that was in the ground, these dead dinosaurs, that we could pull them outside of the ground and put them, burn them and create energy. And doing that, we were able to consume and be better capitalists. And we found a lot of benefit to it, but it came at a much later time that we started to realize the stuff that we're burning and putting into the air actually had a problem. The problem was the greenhouse gas effect. And this pollution that went up in the air didn't just evaporate, that in fact it stayed up in the air and it created this blanket over the earth, trapping the sunlight inside of it. And so now with the sun rays trapped inside this blanket of pollution that we've created, now we're starting to see effects, not only warmer temperature, but that atmospheric currents, more natural disasters happening. Now we're starting to see all of this pollution is going into our oceans and acidifying them and actually making creatures dissolve in the acidic oceans. So why is this important? So we've known about climate change for a little bit here, but we're starting to hit the tipping point of where we can keep on polluting when we can stop, and we actually will be able to stop. Because with climate change, you have positive feedback loops, and after we surpass that point, what will happen is we will be unable to stop it. And we are at that point this year. In fact, they said this year is the last chance. As a world, we have a chance to keep below 2 degrees of warming. And in the Paris climate talks, which I'll be at, we're actually going to this will be the last chance where we have to come to an agreement. We've met 21 times now, and we've yet to come to agreement. And this is really the tipping point. And so it's very important what happens here, whether we decide whether we're going to make the world look like this or like this. This is at what's stake here. So I'm also going to talk about climate justice. We are a climate justice group, and that gets thrown around a lot. And climate justice is different than the regular climate work. Climate justice is led by those who are most impacted, led by frontline communities of color. And one of the main climate justice principles is that we speak for ourselves. And so it's very important that that mainstream environmental groups that want to do climate justice work don't try to speak for communities of color, but make room so that we can speak for ourselves, because our needs are different. Even the threshold of 2 degrees of warming, or what I call where white people burn, is not a good target, because that target at 2 degrees of warming, Africa's already burned up. There are entire islands that will be underwater, but guess who chose that target? not the communities most impacted, because if they did, that would not be where they chose to stop at. So now Afrin's going to talk to you about capitalism.
So the first system of oppression we're going to tackle is Coca-Cola. No, I mean capitalism. But this gives you a really good clue about what capitalism is like. For 130 years, Coca-Cola has said things like, choose happiness, or it's the real thing. But if you really look closely, it is toxic. And that's what capitalism is. So a quick definition. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by a minority for profit, and the majority of people sell their ability to work in return for a wage. And so this already divides society in the capitalist class and the working class. Looking back at history, we have done trade for centuries, but it was only after the discovery of the new land that trade became a big business, and the Industrial Revolution allowed the capitalistic class to produce at a higher scale. This is also when we started moving from hand production towards mass production and started to use coal. Allowing everyone to make profit allowed profiteers to amass wealth. Chasing profit meant they cut costs. They started exploiting their workers, compromising safety, paying lower wages just for the profit line. And so we had slave labor, we had child labor, while the elitist class sat around in their powdered wigs. So you cannot have a capitalistic society without a rich and a poor. And while there's that division, and well, we measure success by growth, the rich are always going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer. And so 200 years after the Industrial Revolution, we are now at a point where 1% of the world's population owns 99% of the wealth. This image shows the wealth distribution of the United States in 2012. And it's not that we've abolished slavery. It is now in our prisons that we exploit our inmates. Prison labor accounts for $2 million of our economy. And Sarah is going to talk about that in much more detail. And sweatshops, we've all heard stories of how people are exploited. And once again, these are people in the global south. These are people of color. And we've heard about the toxic conditions in which they continue to be exploited, just so that we can have cheap things to buy. So how did we get embedded in this system? How did they get us to participate in this system? It really was very clever and cleverly designed. In 1955, after the Second World War, when the corporations and government were thinking about ways in which to grow our economy, a retail analyst called Victor Libau said, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, and replaced and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate." And so if we start to look closely at this system, this is the materials economy. This is the system that we are deeply embedded in. And at every stage, if we look closely, people are exploited, right from extraction, where natural resources are destroyed, people's way of life is taken away from them, and at the stages of production, distribution, people are exploited, the world is polluted, and then we are made to imagine that we need to consume more and more. This is a linear system, and it's a system in crisis, because we cannot exist on a linear system on a finite planet. And so we consume, and we consume twice as much as we did 50 years ago. We have, in the United States, 5% of the world's population, but we use 30% of the world's resources and make 30% of the waste. If everybody on the planet consumed at the rate at which we do, we would need 3 to 5 planets to sustain this way of life. And we are exporting this vision of the American dream to other countries. These other countries in what we call the third world are aiming to live in the standard that we do. Because we measure the success of our economy by our gross domestic product. And so that means we need to produce more and more to measure our success. And it doesn't mean that we produce more good things. We just produce more. More pollution, more consumption. That's how we measure our growth. So all of our decisions that we make as a country are designed to get this number to grow without thinking about the consequences, without thinking about if it is sustainable. And where does that leave us as people and as a society? We are overworked, underpaid, isolated, unhappy, and unhealthy. And in that race for more, we have lost touch with nature. We have forgotten our spiritual selves. We have lost that connect. And corporations have gotten away with poisoning us. And it takes us years and years to really figure out the consequences of the things that they have done. And even today, they continue to mock us with their power. The CEO of Nestle said, access to water should not be a public right. And they continue to bottle water that creates all of this pollution. They continue to bottle water in California during a drought. They continue to tap this natural resource and make us pay money so that they can earn a profit. Whereas the wisdom of indigenous folks for centuries has always proclaimed that water is sacred. How far away are the capitalists from this point of view? So moving on to 3 really important numbers in the climate change world, and we talked briefly about the first one, the 2 degrees Celsius, which you've probably heard. And once again, this is a Western capitalistic number because it was agreed upon by Western nations. A lot of nations in the global South and island nations did not agree to this number. So this is the number that a large majority of the countries have agreed that 2 degrees Celsius of warming is where we must stop our increase in global temperature. If we go beyond that, this planet is not habitable for white people. The second number is 565 gigatons of carbon. This is how much more carbon we can safely put in the atmosphere to stay below that 2 degrees of warming. And so at the current rate, we will hit this number in about 15 years. But this is as much carbon as we can safely burn by mid-century. And the final number, 2,795 gigatons of carbon. This is the carbon already contained in the reserves of the fossil fuel companies. This is how much carbon, which is 5 times more than the amount we can burn. This is how much the fossil fuel companies are planning on burning, because this is what their stock market value is dependent. This is what their stock market value is based on. This is what nations are already budgeting on. This is what we are trading on. So for Shell and Exxon, this is as much carbon as we are going to burn. It is not compatible with a sustainable planet. And looking back, Exxon knew 30 years ago, Exxon's scientists had enough evidence to know where we would be today. This recently came out to public knowledge, and we don't know how many other fossil fuel companies knew, but Exxon knew. And if they had revealed to the public, we would may have not been where we are today. Just 90 companies in the world have caused 2/3 of the man-made global warming emissions. This is the company, these are the corporations with 1%. And are they done? Are they done with all the lies and deceiving? Nope. They are now planning, they have now proposed this deal, which goes under as a fair trade deal. But really, out of the 29 chapters, only 5 of the chapters are about trade. The rest of them are going to will give corporations more power than our governments, more power than our local governments, and take away a whole bunch of our freedoms, take away our environment, take away our rights for safe food. I really ask that everybody read up about this and be aware of the TPP and do what you can to stop it. And so they offer us solutions. Corporations have offered a bunch of solutions in the past. And we call them false solutions because they do not take in mind the impact on marginalized people of color. Cap and trade is one such solution. Revenue neutral solutions like carbon war are also false solutions because if you read the fine print, they give corporations through loopholes many ways to continue profit at the cost of our future. And really, the solutions we're looking for are people solutions. Just transition is a term that we use in climate justice organizations. This is a framework for a fair and sustainable shift to a new carbon economy. It is a transition that delivers shared prosperity, good family-supported jobs, and support for people who bear the brunt of climate impact. So look up Just Transition. It is really something to read up on. And I'm going to leave you with this question from a video that I saw a few years ago that really, really affected me. Do we have the courage to face the realities of our time and allow ourselves to feel deeply enough that it transforms us and our future? Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? No?
Yeah.
Yes, you can? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking to you about colonialism. We've talked about capitalism. Colonialism, what is it exactly? Colonialism is referring to the control over a piece of land and its people by a more dominant power. That's the basic definition. This is a world map during the 18th century. And all of the different colors that you see are the different empires, the different colonies belonging to different empires. So the dark red that you see there, up in Canada and India and parts of Africa and Australia, that's the British Empire. The British Empire. The bright red that you see in South America, North America, that's the Spanish Empire. The blue, that's the French Empire. The purple, that's the Russian Empire. The green, that's the Portuguese Empire. What is the unifying factor in all of these different empires? They're all European. They are all white empires. In other words, Europe colonized the rest of the world. What does it mean? It means control over a piece of land and its people. This is the propaganda of empire, of colonialism. Empire is the mother. The British Empire, England, she is the mother, and she nurtures all of her colonies as her children. She nurtures them at her bosom. She is a loving mother. This is the reality. The empires gorge themselves on the blood and sweat and tears of the people that they colonized. And of course, this country right here, as you saw, this country was also part of the British Empire. And this country fought the British to be free of that empire, and then this country became the empire. And they became the empire using this phrase, manifest destiny. They used that as their justification. What was manifest destiny? To overspread and possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government. So this country basically said, we've got the best government idea in the whole world. Providence has given it to us. In other words, God has given it to us. So we have freedom, and so it is our right to dominate this entire continent and take control over it and its people. And this was the propaganda of that government. Lady Liberty, flying over the continent. If you notice, she's got power lines in her hands. She's bringing electricity. If you notice, the steam trains burning coal are behind her. If you notice, the ships bringing goods from other countries, bringing slaves from other countries are behind her. The pioneer wagons. Pioneer. This word pioneer, what it means is a white man going somewhere where other white people haven't been before. That's what pioneer means. And here you see the native people and the buffalo, and the natural way of life being pushed away further and further off the land. And they said, well, the reason why, our justification is the fact that we have the best government, right? And that best government came from white men, right? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. Except that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin met frequently with the Iroquois natives. They were a confederation of 6 tribes who lived on the East Coast. And they met frequently with these white men. And they said, you need to get away from the terror of the British Empire. And you need to be free. And the only way that you will be free is if you follow the great law of peace. The great law of peace. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right of women to participate in government, the separation of powers, checks and balances, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, 3 branches of government, and a women's council. A women's council which would judge and settle disputes and legal violations, which we now call the Supreme Court. Other than the Women's Council and the right of women to participate in government, the founding fathers adopted all of these things. And then they said, these are our ideas. That's what makes us the founding fathers. They took the ideas of the natives, and then they used those ideas as their excuse to colonize the rest of the continent. Because they weren't really following the great law of peace. The great law of peace was that everyone was equal, and the idea that peace was the will of the Creator. And yet here they were using slaves to foster growth within their empire, to create control over their empire, to create wealth in their empire. And of course, the natives that gave all of this wisdom, that gave them the great law of peace, that gave them all of these different ideas, those same natives who gave the starving settlers food to survive the winter were forced off their lands and allowed to starve, made to starve. And not only made to starve, but actively killed and murdered in horrific genocides. The only good Indians I ever saw were dead, General Philip Sheridan. And this was the presiding view of the US Army. And if you think that that's just history, we started this saying we are on stolen Duwamish land. The Duwamish tribe were the people of this territory. They were the ones who helped the pioneers when they first got here, and yet the Duwamish tribe is denied recognition of its very existence by our federal government. That happened just this year in 2015. And what we have to remember is, in a colonial empire, the dominant power has control over the land and its people. So in other words, it does whatever it wants with its people, and it does whatever it wants with the land, whether it's cutting down oceans, whether it's poisoning rivers, whether it's slaughtering animals, whether it's taking all of the resources of coal and oil and gas and minerals and gold and silver and jewels and anything that they could possibly make money off of, that's what they take. So this is a map of the British Empire at its height. And I want you to pay attention to Africa right here. If you'll notice, the red is the British Empire. And you will also notice that in the east end there, where you see the horn, a little bit inwards of the horn, that is Ethiopia. Ethiopia was never colonized. This map is incorrect. Ethiopia was the only African country to never be colonized. So that was the height of the British Empire. This is now. All of these companies that you see here, all of these fossil fuel logos that you see here, they're all British. And all of these fossil fuel logos that you see here, they're all French. They are all over Africa. This idea of colonialism being over, it's not over. It's not over. It's exactly the same situation as it was before, only now people don't call it colonialism, they call it growth. Shell, Shell, BP, BP, Shell, Shell. And guess what? Even Ethiopia, that was never colonized, it has Afrin. That's a that's a British company. So what it means is that the corporations are colonial powers. And it's not just in Africa that this is happening. This summer, Shell, a British colonial power, a fossil fuel company, came right here to Seattle with their giant rig. Do you know what it was called? The Polar Pioneer. The Polar Pioneer. And where was it going? It was going up to the Arctic, where brown people live, to colonize that area too. And the only reason why they could even think of doing it was because the Arctic sea ice, which is normally there, has been melted by the warming that they are causing by burning fossil fuels. We also fight wars to maintain this fossil fuel empire. John Bolton, who was the US ambassador in many different parts of the world, of the Middle East, he said, it is a critical oil and natural gas producing region that we, the USA, have fought so many wars to try to protect our economy from the adverse impact of losing that supply. This empire depends on fossil fuels. And as you see here, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, all of these places that have lots and lots and lots of oil and lots and lots and lots of fossil fuels. It's so strange how they're just always fighting, right? Isn't it so weird? All we ever see in the media is, oh, they're fighting again in the Middle East. Why? Because we keep dropping bombs on them and stealing their resources. You know, Iran is so evil, right? Iran, they hate us for our freedom. Iran wants war with us. They want war so much. Look how close they put their country to our military bases. One US soldier, when asked to justify the war on terror, he said, you know, you grew up so bad wanting to be Luke Skywalker, but then you realize that you're basically a stormtrooper, a nameless, faceless rifleman carrying a spear for empire. Corporate colonial control coming soon. It's called the TPP. Afrin mentioned it. This is a devastating giveaway of power to the corporations. It will mean the end of democracy as we know it. It will mean the end of national sovereignty. Because if we try to regulate anything the fossil fuel companies do, if we try to regulate anything to do with our food, to do with our water, to do with chemicals in our air, in our water, in our land, they can sue our governments because that cuts into their profit. To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you're not allowed to criticize. We're never allowed to criticize the job creators. Africa and many different parts of Africa were dominated by the process of slavery, by the colonial slave holders. And now it's dominated by debt. Do you know that the reason why so many of these countries have debt is because when they won their freedom from the colonizers, the colonizing empire said, you need to pay us reparations because we've lost our property. This is a map, at the top, this is a map of all of the countries in the world that have put out the most greenhouse gas in our planet. So if you see the red, all of North America, all of Russia, all of Europe, Australia, all of these places are the places that have put out the most greenhouse gas emissions. And in blue, those are all of the countries that have given the least. Now below, all of the countries in blue are the countries that are least impacted by climate change. And all of the countries in red are the countries most impacted. In other words, the white people are killing the brown and black people. That's what this means. The Daily Mail, which is a British newspaper, it put out an article with this map, and it said, go to all of these countries before they're wiped out by climate change, all of the countries in yellow, orange, red, all of those countries. Go to them before they're wiped out by climate change. not to help them, not to, oh, these people need help, you should go there. No, no, no. Go and enjoy these countries before they're wiped out. It's colonial white oppression yet again. Because that is what this is. Colonialism, empire is white supremacy. If you do not see climate change as a racial justice issue, you do not understand what's really going on. And I'm going to hand it to Sarah.
So I'm going to talk about the prison industrial complex, a term coined by Angela Davis, a civil rights activist and prison abolitionist. To quote her on the definition, imprisonment has become the response of first resort to far too many of the social problems that burden people in poverty. These problems often are veiled by conveniently grouped together under the category crime and by the automatic attribution of criminal behavior to people of color. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from the public view when human beings contending with them are relegated to cages. Or, in other words, the prison industrial complex is a system where prisons have been made into a profiteering institution by systematically increasing their populations to benefit from slave labor. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, yet it contains 25% of the world's prison labor, as well as 25% of the world's pollution. The U.S. has more prisoners and pollution than anywhere else in the world. 1 in 3 Americans now have a criminal record, but it did not always used to be like this. The total incarcerated population in the U.S. is 2.4 million. That's a 500% increase over the past 30 years. So this graph right here, it shows the correlations between the policies and prison populations, and you can begin to see how the trigger starts with the war on drugs, is when the age of mass incarceration begun. But in order to understand this, we have to go back to where it started. The prison industrial system started at the end of slavery. Now, we've all been told that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It did with one exception, criminals. Given that loophole, vacancy laws and loitering laws were created which criminalized not having a job or loitering. Newly freed black people that were found standing around on a block with friends could be arrested arbitrarily, making them slaves again. This was black codes. Through convict leasing, prisoners were rented out, and the free slaves that were arrested could be rented out back to the plantations that they were freed from. Convict leasing was also used to rent out convicts for coal mines, one of the leading causes of climate change causing pollution. Least incarcerated deaths in the coal mines were 10 times higher than the non-incarcerated mine workers. Prison labor is the only legal form of slavery in the United States, thanks to the 13th Amendment. And since the abolition of slavery, prisons have held a disproportionate amount of black people. There are now more black people in prison than there were slaves in the 19th century. Nixon was the first to declare a war on drugs, which has really turned into a war on people of color. You see, Nixon received political power by the people by putting forth propaganda about drug lords and crime, despite the fact that crime rates at the time were actually going down. He also listed marijuana as a Schedule I drug, meaning it has no medical or research potential, and if caught with it, you were sentenced harsher than cocaine or heroin. Heroin is a Schedule II drug. Alcohol is a Schedule III drug, yet alcohol kills more people than all the drugs combined. But who uses alcohol most? White men. Reagan passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986, which created mandatory minimums and sentenced people found with 1 gram of crack 100 times worse than cocaine. And the only difference between crack and cocaine, beside a little baking soda, is who's using it and where it's found, with crack being a rich white drug and cocaine being a rich white drug and crack a poor black drug. This happened during the Nicaragua-Iran-Contra, where the government assisted or turned a blind eye to the drug cartels in Nicaragua who were smuggling cocaine into America via drug lords in the inner city. These laws and others after it created this system that is now the prison industrial complex. The ending result is our disproportionate prison statistics that we have today, where 1 in 3 black men are in jail, and also contributes to the $2 billion economy, which is the prison system. The prison system has become a debtor system. 24 states in this country, including Washington State, are legally allowed to charge for room and board and other fees to rack up while you're in jail. And when you get out, you're burdened with a load of debt you earned with interest while in jail. And your punishment isn't over when your sentence is over. Thanks to laws passed by Bill Clinton, if you have a felony, especially a drug offense, they do not allow you to have financial aid, public housing assistance, public food assistance, and public health assistance. And a criminal record is the only thing that they can legally discriminate against you in unemployment or employment and housing. So it's no wondering why recidivism or reoffense rates in this country is around 77% after 5 years out of prison. On top of this, many prisons are cutting their educational programs. On top of the fact that prisons are banning certain empowering and self-improvement books like 44 Laws of Power and other books by Robert Greene are banned, further stratifying prisoners from help. But there is help. Community-based organizations that offer programs for newly released prisoners lower chances by as much as 50% from them returning. These types of groups and other support systems are essential for detangling and dismantling the prison industrial system. Today, prisons are a huge source of profit. Prisons are now even privatized, hired by the state out of contracts. The contracts have quotas of how many beds they have full. And since they're paid per bed, they have an incentive to have more people in prison because it makes more money for privatized prisons. This conflict of interest has led to much corruption. Wives of judges have been found, they have actually been sentencing, wives of judges who are doing the sentencing have been found to be invested in prisons. Recently in Pennsylvania, a judge went to jail for a Kids for Cash scandal, accepting money from the owner of a privatized juvenile detention center to sentence kids longer and harsher. Class 2 prison labor is anything from stamps, license plates, furniture, and military equipment. All state agencies, including this state, are required to buy from Class 2 prison labor. So that means when we're in school learning, we're actually sitting on desks made by prisoners. And because the states are required to buy from this labor, you now give the prison system a monopoly on these markets. Yet Washington state law says prisoners are paid on a gratuity or tip scale, meaning they are hardly even paid to work. In fact, the average is 42 cents an hour. Privatized prisons also pay their laborers even less and monopolize markets worldwide. Through using slave labor in prisons that's cheaper than sweatshops and other countries. This causes poor countries to be relegated to extraction of resources since they can't compete with our slave markets. Companies like Starbucks, Microsoft, Boeing, they've all used prison labor and paid people pennies on the hour for work that would have been paid around $15 to $25 an hour. So, climate change is bringing increased natural disasters, including wildfires and hurricanes. During these disasters, prisoners have no agency and they have no say in what whether or not they will be evacuated. In fact, the evacuation plan for most prisoners is for the staff to leave and the prisoners to stay locked up. And that's what happened in Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Sandy, and Hurricane Katrina. Prisoners were left in their cells to die. Prisoners are also given the most dangerous jobs, put on the front lines of firefighting and oil spills and cleanup. Prisoners are paid around $3 an hour to fight fires without the proper training, while firefighters are paid between $20 to $35 an hour. Increased temperatures creates increased heat strokes inside of jails. In 2012, one of the hottest years in human history, 10 inmates died of a heat stroke in Texas within 10 days of each other. In New Hampshire, prisoners went on a food strike to fight for fans during a heat wave. These conditions will become more common with climate change. In fact, in California, with the wildfires that are being put on more common because of climate change, they're actually saving money by using prisoners. And they got charged by their Supreme Court for having too many prisoners, and they said you had to let some of them go. But California argued they couldn't let the prisoners go because they couldn't lose this cheap labor of these firefighters.
So is it really that bad? Is it really that awful? We're fracking for gas, and we're drilling for oil, and we're mining for coal, and then we burn it all, and it goes all into the atmosphere. And we understand that climate change is happening because of this. But what a lot of people don't know is that these are not the only ways in which greenhouse gases are going into our atmosphere. Animal agriculture is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. Over 51%, the World Watch Institute says. The UN did a study, and they said in that study that without a global shift to a vegan diet, it is impossible to combat climate change. And the reason why is because there are 3 gases. There's carbon dioxide that we all know about and have heard about. There's methane, and there's nitrous oxide. Methane and nitrous oxide are much less in our atmosphere, so no one talks about them. But methane is 20 times more deadly than carbon, and nitrous oxide 50 times more deadly. And they both come out of the animal agricultural industry. The meat, fish, and dairy industries are responsible for this. 80% of all of the forests that have been cut down to make way for animal agriculture. And who eats that meat? Who eats that meat? It's the rich people in rich countries such as this one, such as Europe. So basically the rich white people. Because the majority of the grain that the world produces goes to feeding the cattle that actually feeds a very small percentage of the world's population. The feces and urine that comes out of all of these factory farms and goes into the ocean, goes into our lakes and our streams and our rivers that then take it into the ocean, that has created dead zones around our ocean. The University of Maryland says parts of the ocean floor are rotting. And of course, that means that our water is polluted. And the water usage that is necessary to raise animals for food is ridiculous. We're talking about 25 gallons of water for 1 pound of wheat. 2,500 gallons of water for 1 pound of beef. And of course, the energy not only to raise these animals, but to slaughter them, butcher them, transport them, refrigerate them, transport them again, package them, transport them again into your refrigerator, and then you eat. And what it means with all of these fossil fuels, with all of the deforestation, with all of the animal agriculture, with all of the water, with all of the pollution, with all of the feces, with all of the methane and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, we have these wildfires. That's Washington State this year. And then, of course, we have droughts. I don't need to tell anyone here who is from Ethiopia about droughts. My own country, India, is suffering appalling droughts and have suffered them for many years. It is happening all over the global south. And then, of course, we have the opposite problem of devastating floods. This is a photo of Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines 2 years ago. At that time, it was the largest storm to ever make landfall in human history until Hurricane Patricia this year. What all this means is that the increased temperatures that are leading to these climatic disasters are also melting the Arctic ice and the Antarctic ice on the South Pole. And what that means is that that increases the ocean sea levels. So we see here, this is 1984. This is 2012. That's the Arctic sea ice. It's half of the size that it was, less than half. That picture over there, that's a picture of President Nasheed. President Nasheed of the Maldives is a climate hero. And his country is the first country that is slated to be underwater by 2084, I believe, is the date. And I may be wrong, but it's definitely 2080 something. But they are the first country that's going to be wiped off the face of the planet, an entire country. And to raise awareness, he held a government cabinet meeting underwater on the floor of the ocean to show people, this is what my people are facing. And it's not just him, our own coastline. Remember, we live in Seattle. We're on the coast here. We live on the West Coast. When those sea levels rise, all of these coastlines, everything that you see in red, will be underwater. That includes Seattle, that includes Olympia, that includes Tacoma, Bellingham, Everett. It'll all be gone. The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, released an article where they said the climate crisis has been caused by just 90 companies. Just 90 companies are responsible for this. And Utah Phillips, he says the earth isn't dying, it's being killed. And the people killing it have names and addresses. Eugene Debs, he said the class which has the power to rob upon a large scale has also the power to control the government and legalize its robbery. That's what the TPP is. We're going to make it impossible for you to prosecute us for the terrible things that we've done. We're going to make it impossible for you to regulate us. We're going to make it impossible for you to actually do anything to stop us. Did you know that the US military is the world's largest user of petroleum? So we fight these wars in the Middle East to go and get oil so that we can fight wars. That's what we're doing. And if you think that our soldiers and our people only go off and fight other people in other countries, no, they're fighting us right here. Because those of us who are rising up against the climate crisis, against this capitalistic system, against this racist system, against the prison industrial complex, against so many oppressions of this colonial empire, those of us who are rising up are being attacked by those same colonial powers. This is a picture of Shell No activists who are out there on the water on June 15th, the day that Shell's Arctic drilling rig, the Polar Pioneer, was leaving our waters to go up to the Arctic. And they were out there to stop that thing with their own bodies. And our Coast Guard arrested them and allowed the Shell rig to pass through. In other words, our Coast Guard, their name is Coast Guard. They're supposed to guard our coast. They're supposed to guard us. And yet, the Shell No activists were there guarding the coast, and the Coast Guard arrested them and protected the colonial oppressive power and allowed it to go by. It's called the Green Scare. Back in the 1950s, it was called the Red Scare. Anything communist was evil. Anything communist, oh my God, no, it needs to be, gotten rid of as fast as possible. Now they're saying that about eco-activists. They're saying that about environmentalists. They're saying that about climate justice activists. President Nasheed of the Maldives, he's in prison right now. He's in prison because he spoke out about climate change. And the powers in his country that were allied with the white, Eurocentric, West-centric colonial powers found a way to put him in prison. And these are his people protesting, saying, he is our president. We democratically elected him. Release him. And our own groups right here, Rising Tide in Idaho, were protesting the fracking and the coal trains and the oil trains, investigated by the FBI. But we have to do what we're doing. We have to do it because this is the face of climate change. Those are refugees from Hurricane Katrina that happened in New Orleans. Notice how they're all black. Notice how they're all poor. This is a climate refugee camp for youth in Bali. They're innocent people and they have nowhere to go. This is the projected impact of climate change on agricultural yields. Remember food that we mentioned before? Yeah, all of these countries in red and orange and yellow, they're all going to starve. Notice how they're all black and brown countries. And yet here in Washington state, we have been in drought for the last 2 years. Serious droughts. We grow food here too, and our crops are in trouble. There won't be any food if we allow this to continue. This was what the people of the Philippines wrote on the roads after Typhoon Haiyan hit them. Help, we need food and water. This is what we said after Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast. Apart from the numbers, which you didn't even notice because you were looking at the sexy silhouette of the woman, who, by the way, is Hurricane Sandy, right? The numbers that are most important to our system are 8 million without power in the US and 18,000 flights cancelled. The numbers at the bottom are 6,400 New Yorkers homeless and 4,500 New Jerseyans also homeless. Those are afterthoughts. The most important thing is that we're not consuming. We're not paying money into the system, into the colonial capitalist system. This year in India, they were hit by a 122 degrees Fahrenheit heat wave. The human body starts to cook at 102. So the government said, don't go out, don't go anywhere, stay home, drink water, don't go out, it's too dangerous. So that's what the people did. They tried to stay home, but what if you have to go out? What if you don't go to work, your kids don't eat? What if you don't go to work, you don't have a roof over your head? What if there's no water where you live? The result was 2,330 Indians dead in 2 weeks. And a week later, 1,000 Pakistanis died of the same heat wave. They were poor, they were homeless, and no one knew who they were because they were poor and they were homeless. So their government had to bury them in unmarked graves. This is the face of the colonial, capitalist, racist system. These people were so dehumanized, so devalued, their own government didn't know who they were. And of course, it's women who suffer the most. Women around the world spend 16 million hours per day looking for water. How are you supposed to look for food? How are you supposed to take care of your kids? How are you supposed to look for a job? How are you supposed to claw your way out of poverty if you're spending 16 million hours a day looking for water? And this is the result: desperation and poverty and helplessness. And it really is much worse than you think. Because as Sarah mentioned before, all of the carbon pollution that we're putting into our atmosphere goes into our ocean. And that's creating ocean acidification. And what that means is that the acid in our ocean, if it reaches a certain point, phytoplankton, which is the basis of our entire food chain, that will die. That will go extinct. And if phytoplankton goes extinct, the entire food chain will collapse. In other words, there won't be any food. And not only that, but phytoplankton also produces at least 50% of our oxygen. So there won't be any food, there won't be any air, and there won't be any water because we've polluted it with all of the oil. And because of this, scientists agreed in 2002 that the world faces mass extinction. There's only been 5 in this planet's history. The last one killed the dinosaurs. And this year, in 2015, scientists came out and said, we're not facing mass extinction, we're in it. It's an emergency.
all of that. So we're going to go right into solutions and actually skip our break, and then we're going to go to break after this. So I think we tend to have historical, So we tend to have historical or amnesia, and we forget that Washington State was built on an economy that was not sustainable. It was logging 2,000-year-old old-growth forests. From the beginning, capitalism has not been sustainable. Nature and human have always suffered in this system. So for us, it's easy to get caught in this feedback loop, to not know how to break free, to feel isolated, alone, knowing that change needs to happen, but not sure how. And often the only time we take a moment to pause is when life forces us to, in forms of life events like health issues, breakups, or end of the year around the holidays and reflections. That's the only time when we actually take a break. And Margaret Wheatley reminds us that those benefiting from the present system have no interest in your new ideas. In fact, your thinking is a threat to them. The moment you start to think, you want to change something. So in this factory life, in this factory school, the system needs us, needs me to be unhappy, to use their product as coping in my search for identity and purpose. By design, I numb my emotions, an addiction of chocolate, electronics, and caffeine. Where's my slide? Okay, so the opposite of addiction is actually connecting. So the fact that you're here in community is an act of rebellion. And Martin Luther King says, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So the Buchanan Institute has this two-loop theory of change, where one of the system is actually declining, and Zarna's favorite word, pioneering a new system is happening. And this system allows you to see, where do you fit in this? Do you help name and connect everybody, or are you nourishing and developing a new system? Well, the other one is hospicing and dying. So we're direct action activists. We disrupt the system. This is Zarna and I at T5, Terminal 5, locking down. And that's when we were talking, figuring out how to change the narrative of the environmental movement, because for so long it's been controlled dominantly by white men, and that have very limited framework. So there's a theory of 3.5%. That's all we need of the population to change the regime, to change the system of nonviolent movements. It has to be nonviolent because it's more inclusive in gender, race, any physical abilities to participate from elder to youth. So direct action. When you're in direct action, it's actually the power of the people. The degree of separation decreases. So the likelihood that somebody in here is connected to somebody in the police department, to the government, to the CEO of a corporation. And Grace Lee Boggs also said that it needs to be nonviolent because it gives the capacity of human beings to grow, gives them the opportunity to grow their souls. And we owe that to each other, the opportunity to change. When we're talking about direct action, even just this photo itself initiated so many conversations individually, communities, and nationally on whether or not you're for, against, or you're just idling in between. It initiates a conversation. And as a reminder, our silence will not protect us. So oftentimes, Zarna, Sarah, the more vocal ones of us, are usually up in front of the port commissioners and the city council, reminding them that we're here. And part of this is also connecting with the indigenous rights, standing with their recognition. Our next goal is stopping, well, currently there is oil and coal trains coming through Seattle, and there's all these terminals that are being built. And the only way that we can actually stop these terminals, because there's no local jurisdiction in Seattle, it's mandated by federal, is actually working with indigenous communities with their treaty rights. So we're building a new system. Martin Luther King says, I am convinced that if we are going to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. So oftentimes when we talk about movements, we don't always talk about how it gets started. So the Highlander Center in Tennessee is a place that was created to help have conversations, because there's no power for change greater than a community that discovers what it cares about. And in that center, they were able to nurture leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, just in that center, creating two movements for the civil rights movement and the labor rights. And all of this is getting us to slow down enough to have conversations. It's like we have forgotten how to be human. The moment we take time to connect with humans, the fact that you choose to be here in the circle is witnessing each other's complexities, to listen instead of reacting. So often in circles, we're moving at a different pace. We're protesting in that way. Instead of looking at our watches, we're actually looking at each other and listening. And what's coming up next is the Rainier Beach Restorative Justice Project. And so it's a different way of, instead of throwing our youth into prisons and locking them up, it's actually listening to their complexity, what caused and what was the complexity that led up to that action. So this is coming soon. There will be trainings too. So Malhorn says that education involves being able to practice those things as your struggle to build a decent society that can be nonviolent. So all it needs is a space. So when students in Taiwan locked down their legislative office with chairs blocking the doors and did a sit-in for 3 weeks, it's because they recognized their own power, because they had conversations. When Hong Kong had the umbrella revolution of 200,000 or more, they didn't see the polarity, they didn't see the police, and was holding umbrellas for them because they recognized that they're all on the same side, the human side. So the history reminds us that minority decisions have become the majority decision, that any society which does not allow for this to happen is going to die. So the question is what is your part in this movement? Because the movement is happening with or without you. And I have to remind us that Fort Lawton was the Daybreak Star back in the 1970s, took it over. The Native Americans did. And this also ignited for the same to happen in Columbia City. And oftentimes we forget those stories, that this has been done before. And more stories that happened with Coyote Village in Olympia. When I was there for Evergreen, it was weekly conversations between the businesses, between mayors, between the community about what would this look like. So part of this, in the loops, is creating a value shift, and to actually buy nothing and to live with minimal. And if we demand this kind of quality from restaurants and from our products, from our phones to for it to actually work and get us to where we need to go and keep track of our days, then we could demand this of our society, of our government. And changing the economy. Instead of hoarding, it's a gifting economy. Collaborative consumption, AKA sharing things. And I think part of the paradigm shift is that we project our perfectionism or our expectations onto our products, our produce, our fruits and strawberries. And part of this is recognizing that it's going back to the roots, to the indigenous wisdom, that it's actually tasting the soil and knowing the city, knowing what's around us, knowing that there's fallingfood.org, that there's 200 apple trees in Cap Hill, that on Westlake Avenue, all of that is hazelnut or chestnut trees, though I don't know if they're edible. But the thing is actually knowing and recognizing those plants. And part of this is closing the loop, knowing where things go, knowing where they come from. And the number one thing that anyone can do is actually to start a plant-based diet, whether it's for 1 day, 2 days, and that goes the same with fish. And once we're able to figure out that change is needing to happen right now, that we have the answers, that it can be done, trees planting. Oh no. Well, part of it is converting trash into resources for Earthship Seattle, which is, there's no photos. It's okay. So part of this is decolonizing our mind. Thanks, Regent. So abstinence on sex education doesn't work. I think we can probably agree on that. So pretending racism doesn't exist at all doesn't work. It's recolonizing how, recognizing how I've been influenced by the system. What is the lens I see the world with? What are my triggers? That is the beginning. And because we are what we repeatedly do, therefore excellence is not an act, it's actually a habit. So I think it's taking a moment to recognize what are your daily rituals? What feedback loops are you caught in? How do you cope in this oppressive system? What grounds you and nurtures your soul? And one of the great laws of peace from the is about the seventh generation. So these are some questions to consider as you sit with your heart. And in the spirit of Whitney Houston, how will I know? Another soul that was lost in the system. How will they know that you care deeply enough to learn to change your ways? How will they know that you lived joyfully? How will they know that you surrounded yourself with community for greater purpose? How will they know that even though you were hurt and traumatized by the system, that you found the strength to prevent that from happening to them? How will they know that you showed up every day carrying them with you? How will they know that you chose the unknown route, grounded in purpose, of higher knowing that change needs to happen? How will they know that you lived with intention? So we're going to go on break. How do we empower those directly affected by climate change without reinforcing colonialism?
Without reinforcing colonialism. So I think this is an important question to ask because I think a lot of dominant groups with power, when they try to help, it becomes paternalistic and it becomes like a neo-colonialism. But essentially the way is instead of like there are reparations to be had and owed, and instead of looking at it like a charitable giving, it's giving up your privilege, actually giving it up instead of a charitable giving. I think there's a difference there, and the difference is the difference between paternalism and actual liberation.
Okay, so the next question that I have is, how can teens be more aware, or how can teens get involved? So what we've seen throughout history is that in any movement for social change, it is successful when the teens power it. So the involvement of the youth is essential. It's not just, oh, how do we get them more involved? It's how do we help them and back them up when they lead us to change? That's the real question. And the first and foremost way to do it is to tell them it's happening. Yeah? If you have children, if you have nieces, if you have nephews, if you have brothers, if you have sisters, you talk to them about what is happening and you make them aware. You put resources before them that will help them. There are so many groups, Plant for the Planet, Earth Guardians, Seattle Tilth has a group where they are teaching high school students how to grow permaculture gardens. There are so many different ways, whether it's online, on YouTube, on Facebook, there are so many different ways where young people can learn how to cook plant-based food, where they can learn how to write to their politicians. If there is no group nearby, they can form their own. Guess what? They have the power to do that. They have the power. You don't have to wait for anyone. My biggest advice to you is don't wait for anyone to save you. You save yourself and you save your family, you save your friends, you save your community. You don't wait for any politician to do it. They won't. Thank you. Okay.
I can take a quick one.
Okay.
Is the TPP a done deal, or is there something we can do? And I'm not sure. But, I mean, I know it's not a done deal. I know that it is really, really close to being a done deal. And I'm wondering if any of you all know more. But there is scope for us to step up and voice our dissents, voice our opposition, and that really is what we have to do, and do it quickly. I think it is a matter of the next 2 or 3 months in which it can go through. So it's really, really close, but we have to stop it.
And I can add. So to add to that, they said that Arctic drilling was a done deal. They said that the Keystone XL pipeline was a done deal. And we proved them wrong. And how did we do it? We did it with direct action. We did it with our own bodies. We did it by saying, no, you are not going to do this. Shall no. So the TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is a treaty that was written by corporations for governments to sign. And the governments are bought by the corporations, so they're just saying, here, give it to us, we'll sign it. So what's happening is our President Obama is forcing it through our Congress at a very fast rate. And the reason why is because they don't want any of us reading it and finding out what's actually in it. But things have been leaked that are showing that this is basically giving up democratic power. And so that's what the TPP is. So what we have to do is we have to show up in our city councils, in our at the ballot box, in our state governments, in our local governments. We have to be out in the streets. We have to block the roads. We have to block the railways. We have to block the shipping lines. We have to block the ports. We have to do everything possible to show them this world belongs to us. It doesn't belong to them. And we're going to make ourselves clear by all the non-violent means necessary.
I just want to expand a little bit. For those that don't know specifically what the TPP can do, the TPP would actually give it power. Basically, it directs like fair trade, unabated trade. And so what happens is, like, let's say there is a law that, like, for example, environmental and social and labor standards can actually get in the way of the TPP, and they'll say, well, you signed this, you said you're going to promote free trade, and your labor laws here or your environmental laws are getting in the way, and they can sue them. On top of that, it extends patents across the world, and so especially in the global south, where the generic medicine is all they can afford, and the patents would be extended to those countries so they would no longer be able to afford their medication. And these are only a few of the issues with TPP. I've got 2 questions here, and the answer is the same, so I'm going to answer them both. The first question is, can you share ways that communities can shift away from capitalist mindsets? The second question is, how can undeveloped countries bring about economic development without capitalism? And does socialism really work, or is there another alternative? And there is alternatives. And I would say the greatest alternative is going back to the village, the model where the community takes care of itself. autonomous communities that support each other. And so one of these, I can give you an example, one small example in Mississippi, and it's called Cooperation Jackson. And in Mississippi, it was a black community that they were facing racism, and they were not, like white people were not employing them. On top of that, they were living along Cancer Alley where they would dump industrial waste, and so they needed a way to both protect the environment and employ themselves. And so what they did is, through this what is called this Cooperation Jackson, first they started a farm. And they started a farm, and they started growing food, and then from that farm they created a restaurant. And in the farm and in the restaurant, there are co-ops. And so the co-ops is where every worker is an owner. So there isn't these hierarchies and power differences. Everyone's making about the same amount of money because you're all workers and owners. And so then in the restaurant, they took the food they grew in their farm and put it and sold it in their restaurant. And then from there, once they were able to, they created like a compost and recycling center, another co-op. And so they were able to take this food from the restaurant, the scraps, and compost it and create new soil and then bring it back to their farm. And what they did there is create a closed loop system, a system that can sustain itself within the ecosystem. And then once they started that, they were able to generate revenue. And so now with this revenue, they're starting culture centers, and they're buying up land, community land trusts. Every worker is an owner, and now the worker owners are starting to buy up homes, so the community owns homes. And so these are new types of systems, new types of ways that we can live, where we're not just dealing, we're not having the same, like this capitalistic system where everyone's an individual and you have to make more, and every worker is your competition. Instead, everyone, has to come together and work together. And so to answer the question also with undeveloped countries, I think it's really important that a lot of times underdeveloped countries are given like these loans and stuff from World Bank and IMF, new forms of colonialism, because with those loans could become chains, and the World Bank gets to tell them how they're going to run their company, because now they owe them this debt. So it's best if we start to build from the ground up and build naturally, instead of continuing these systems of colonialism.
Okay. Thank you. Can you all actually hear me? I think my mic is working. So this question is, how does patriarchy relate to the other problems we talked about tonight? And how does patriarchy intersect with systems of oppression? What can men do? So this is actually integral to what we're talking about. When we're talking about nature, when we're talking about the planet, when we're talking about Mother Earth, what many indigenous cultures call Mother Earth. In the Western colonial capitalist society, we don't say Mother Earth. We say the resources of this planet. We say the third rock from the sun. That's what we say. So this idea of the earth being our mother, the earth nurturing us, and we being children, we all being in the same family, and therefore we all being answerable to each other and to our mother, that has disappeared because of the colonialist capitalist system that tells us that it is the right of white men to control everything. And what that means is, not only does it mean that people of color are marginalized, it means that women are marginalized. Because if women don't matter, the earth doesn't matter either. And so when we're talking about patriarchy, and one of the things that we were talking about is that at some point we've been talking about doing just a whole session on patriarchy itself, because it's so huge. But in particular in this country, when we're talking about the idea of what masculinity is, the idea of masculinity is basically make lots of money and have lots of women and take whatever you want and never apologize. Never apologize. If you look at the Republican Party in particular, we never apologize for anything. We're number one, right? That is this idea of this hyper-masculine sense of self, which is really, when you think about it, it's got nothing to do with being a man. It's got nothing to do with your physiology. It's got nothing to do with your identity. It's got nothing to do with who you are as a son, as a brother, as a husband. It's this idea of who you are, because if you are not that, you're not consuming. Because if you're not that, you're not going to be taking all of these resources and using them however you want. So even when it comes down to our food, this idea of we're going to go in and alter the DNA, and we have a right to do that. We can control everything around us. We can control nature. We can take from nature, and we're not answerable to nature. That is what is going on in our system, and it is a patriarchal system. This idea that we can go into the earth and drill into the earth whether she wants it or not. We can take from her whether she wants it or not. That's a patriarchal system. So it does intersect. And when we're talking about what can be done, we need to talk about this idea of masculinity. We need to talk about what true masculinity is. And when we look at ancient wisdom, when we look at indigenous wisdom, it is a very different idea of what masculinity is and what femininity is. And I don't want to get too much into it because there's a whole other thing. But I think it's good.
Two more questions that I think are pretty close. What does leadership look like in this revolution? How can community support both direct action and not? So what does leadership look like? Leadership looks like this room right here. The leadership looks like us coming here to have this conversation, us coming here speaking out. The four of us here are not experts. We are not any different than you. Any of you could be here sharing your voices, speaking up and educating people around you. And that is what this revolution needs. This revolution doesn't need a single leader or a single person bringing solutions. It needs us learning, questioning, challenging the system, and coming up with our own solutions in the way we want our future to be. So that that is what leadership looks like. And how can the community support? Thank you. The community can support by, in the same way, in like stepping up, thinking about these questions. Not everyone is able to do direct action. Not everyone is able to come and blockade in front of a train. But what can you provide? Can you help us with childcare? Can you provide financial resources? Can you can you support people with food? Can you bring water? Can you help people drive to different locations? Can you print flyers? Can you go out, give flyers? Can you talk? Can you organize an event in your community for conversations like this to happen? So there is ways for everyone to contribute. There's ways for everyone to question and see what they want to bring to this movement. And I hope everyone here takes a moment to think about that. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to take one? The next question that we have is, how do people of color approach these issues without censoring their message, especially around white audiences? So this is a question that has come up a lot recently. I was recently speaking at the Binance conference, and I had to deal with this question. Because the truth is, and it is a very difficult truth to hear for white audiences. It is extremely difficult. The truth is that it's very difficult for a person of color to say how they feel, to actually speak the truth without white people thinking that the person of color is an angry person, without thinking, oh, that's an angry black person or an angry brown person or a nagging woman. It's very difficult to ever really say what you feel, even though it's the truth, because of racism, because of patriarchy. And so because of that, people of color never really speak the full truth about anything ever, because they have to survive in this white system. They have to survive under a system of white supremacy and patriarchy. And so what I said at that conference, and it was very difficult for me to say, but what I said was that there has to be truth-telling, and there has to be truth listening. There has to be a willingness from all people to actually listen, because if we don't listen, we're not going to be able to help each other. And remember, we are all children of Mother Earth. We are all children of Mother Earth. And these artificial divides that have been created by colonialism, by capitalism, by white supremacy, they are artificial constructs. We are the same. So as people of color, we need to be talking to everyone, not just our own people, but everyone as family. but also recognizing that as a person of color, my community has been marginalized for hundreds of years, for centuries. And there needs to be willingness in the white population to actually listen to that and to be willing to hear the truth of that and not react and say, oh, I'm not a racist. No one's saying you are, but the system that you live in is racist. And the system that you live in allows you as a white person to profit off the suffering of people of color. So it's not that you're a racist, but you profit off a racist system. And that is what needs to be heard by everyone and understood so that we can move forward and stop covering up the truth. We have to tell the truth, because without the truth, we're not going to move forward.
How do we address the aspect of urgency without disempowering and overwhelming people? I think before you can go forward, you have to be able to see what's in front of you. And I think a lot of the times, especially like mainstream climate movements, they like to talk about, Al Gore talks about, everything is dying, like, we have to do this, like, we don't have a chance. And that's true. But that's not really, especially when you're talking with marginalized populations, they're trying to keep the lights on, and you're talking about all these problems in the future, and it's not really the way to go about it. And I think really, especially if you're working with people who you don't want to disempower or you don't want to overwhelm, it's important that we talk about what the future looks like. We have that vision to move towards. So instead of talking about what the future would look like if we don't take action, we talk about the future, what it would look like when we do take action. Autonomous communities supporting each other. We're talking about local jobs, local food, neighborhoods where you know your neighbors, jobs that you can walk and bike to. We're talking about free transit for everyone, free education for everyone. We're talking about a community that doesn't have asthma. So when you paint the future, when you talk about the potential and you paint this beautiful picture, of course, everyone's going to want to work toward that. And it's much easier to work toward a good solution than a bad one. And the best example I've heard about that is MLK said, I had a dream, not I had a nightmare. Can you imagine what it would look like when you say, I have a nightmare? And that's what the climate movement's been doing by just talking about what happens when we don't take action. We need to be talking about what happens when we do and how beautiful it would look like. We need to get people excited, not scared.
Okay. Do you want to do this? Okay. Is this our last question? Or if you have any other questions, send them up. But this is the last question that we have. And then maybe we can have an open question. How do we move forward when the governments don't admit a problem? For example, Republicans on climate change. So when the Indians in India were working to kick out the British Empire from our country, we didn't wait for them to think, maybe we should leave. We made it happen, okay? We didn't wait for anyone. Because when you're talking about justice, you take justice. You don't wait for someone to give it to you. Another point which Yin brought up in her solutions is that in any movement for change, the truth is that they've done studies, and what they found is that you really only need 3.5% of any given population with you in order for you to make that change. 3.5%. That means we don't need the Republicans, okay? We don't need them. This is happening whether they want it or not, because the will of the people is in this movement. Your will is in this movement, and you're going to show up. And that's why this is going to happen.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to close it out for the evening. Thank you for joining us. Zarna will be selling her books in the corner right behind Ed on the camera. So you're welcome to hang out with us if you have any other questions. And thank you for joining us so much.